Star Wars saves and communist graves. I am, as always, your host, Christopher Paul Dugdale, MEDMA. We are Duncanville High School in these United States, and today is April 19th, 2021. And yes, I do have a new shirt. My wife bought it for me. She loves me so much. Uh, I actually should be sadder today because this is the anniversary of the attack on the Waco compound. Not that I wanted to see anyone die, but I especially don't want to see 23 children die when the government goes into a compound that it had a 54-day siege on, and uh, the place burned down because, and the people stayed there because they believed they were with Jesus Christ, who was the father of the majority of the 30 children that were in there and married to all the women in the camp who were forsaken by their husbands. On the other hand, though, 2 years later, you have the Oklahoma City bombing, which was done in response to the burning of the Waco compound. And well, anyway, what a crappy day. And Hitler's birthday is tomorrow. On the left hand side, you see Mikhail Gorbachev. He was the new Soviet leader. He was different than the other ones. He had to create change because the Soviet Union was falling apart. They couldn't afford to keep up with all the advancements of the United States. So he introduces something called glasnost. This is freedom of speech, the press, and religion, and also gave some political liberty or political freedoms. He also comes with perestroika, which was restructuring the economy by bringing in some capitalism and some private enterprise. All of those are signs that the communist system is falling apart. Now, here's another strange thing that could only happen during the 1980s. Ronald Reagan was watching a movie called Return of the Jedi, and in that there was a space station that would shoot lasers that could destroy other ships or planets. Based on this movie and this movie alone, Ronald Reagan decided to have a press conference where he would introduce initiatives of his own. Now, rather than talk to current scientists about this, uh, he would uh, he would go on in a presidential address and introduce a program without any type of scientific backing at all. Okay, he called this Strategic Defense Initiative. It was labeled Star Wars. And the idea was we would use missiles and lasers to destroy incoming missiles. Okay. Again, we don't even have the technology with lasers now to do this, but he tells the nation in a national address that we were developing and that we were on the verge of being able to use these for peace. Again, we don't have the ability to do this now, and he didn't talk to any scientists first. So the Soviets, they looked at this and they thought, this is a joke, but with all the money we were putting into national defense, maybe we had somehow found some type of massive breakthrough, and that we had somehow come up with this. So Gorbachev said that the Soviets would cut back their nuclear weapons if Reagan gave up the Star Wars or SDI program, the program that did not exist other than in Reagan's mind. But Reagan refused. This is somehow bluffing in a game that millions of people or billions of people could have died. But somehow it worked. Meanwhile, Reagan goes up for re-election. He easily defeats Walter Mondale and Geraldine Ferraro. Geraldine Ferraro there is pictured. She is the first female vice presidential candidate in U.S. history. Uh, Later on, she would work on the campaign of Hillary Clinton, and she got fired for saying something that people said was racist, but it was just stupid. When she worked on Hillary Clinton's campaign in 2008, she said that Obama had an unfair advantage because he was black. Now, in the history of the United States in 2008, there had been zero black presidents. And the very fact that, she would make that comment was kind of dumb and had never happened before in history up until that date. Anyway, uh, Reagan wins by the largest margin in history since Washington was reelected back in 1890 or 1792. Moving on. So the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. This is the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union. Reagan and Gorbachev got together. They agreed to reduce the number of nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union would reduce military spending, and this would lead to economic and political reforms. Communism would collapse in Eastern Europe at the end of the year in 1987, mainly because the Soviets couldn't keep all their forces in those countries. Peaceful elections replaced communism. So instead of communism and the Cold War coming to some major battle where people get killed, it falls apart because of financial reasons. The Soviet Union is almost done, but it's not yet. Nancy Reagan in the 1980s decided to use her status as First Lady to fight against drug use. So she started what was called a war on drugs. She went on a show called Different Strokes and challenged American children to say no to drugs. All children in school at that time, in the majority of schools, went through a program called the President's Drug Awareness Program. On the right hand side, you can see where I was given a certificate of heroism. Okay, for finishing this program, March 8th, 1985. That is Nancy Reagan's signature on the right hand side, or possibly someone who helped her fill them out, called Yuanki Ragoy. I think that says actually Nancy Reagan, but I can't be sure. But anyway, that is an award that I won for finishing the program, which I think every American also received. But I don't know. I have the one program and I have the one certificate. I haven't seen a lot of other people's, so I can only go off of this. Also in the 1980s, Sandra Day O'Connor was nominated to the Supreme Court. She was the first woman to serve on the Supreme Court, and she was nominated by Ronald Reagan. Okay, top right hand corner, that is Sally Ride. She is the first American woman in space. She is not the first woman in space, but she is the first American woman in space. If you remember the song "Ride, Sally, Ride," well, that's about her. On the bottom left hand side, I believe I mentioned whenever we were talking about the space race that many people in my generation dreamed of going to space. All of that really died on the same day because of what happened to her. Krista McAuliffe was one of 7 astronauts for NASA who died in the Challenger disaster. Uh, Students all across the United States watched the Challenger take off. Uh, it was shown, it was such a big deal because Krista McAuliffe was the first civilian to get to go to space. And what this meant for most Americans is if you have a civilian go to space, then everyone could go to space eventually. So, what also made her significant is she was a school teacher and she was going to do some science experiments while she was in space. So, as students across the nation watched the Challenger take off, about 90 seconds into the takeoff, the Challenger exploded, putting many Americans into tears and ruining the dreams of several Americans who had dreamed of going to space. Jerry Falwell on the top left-hand side, he started a program called the Moral Majority. This is a Christian organization that would bring creationism back to school, teaching about God creating the universe as described in the Bible. It would also bring prayer back to school. By the way, prayer is legal in school, but this is talking about school-led prayer. The moral majority was also against feminism, gay rights, abortion, and promiscuity. Promiscuity, by the way, is people engaging in sexual activity before they're married or with people they're not married to. Uh, on a separate or on the same note, Jerry Falwell was caught having sex with a prostitute. Didn't really follow all the things under the moral majority. During the same time period, Planned Parenthood versus Casey. This requires minors to inform their parents about abortions. By minor, I mean people under the age of 18. If you were a coal miner, for instance, who was 35, you didn't have to tell your parents unless you wanted to. But if you were a coal miner under the age of 18, then you probably had to tell your parents twice. Not sure about that, but it would follow with logic. Not good logic. So in the 1980s, you also have these savings and loan scandals. And many banks uh, went bankrupt during the 1980s because they gave loans to third world countries. Now, the thought was, ooh, we give loans to third world countries and we charge them really high interest rates so we can make a lot of money off of them. Sounds like a solid idea until you realize that the reason that these loans weren't repaid is because they didn't have any money because they're third world countries. And while this does help the people in the third world countries, it does put the banks out of business and it threatens several people's retirement. So, good job, 1980s. So, Black Monday, that's October 18th, 1987. On this date, there is the largest decrease in the stock market in US history. This is worse than any of the days in the 1920s during the Great Depression. The US does recover from that within about 6 months, though. Now we get to another really strange moment in US history. This is the Iran Contra scandal. This is confusing, okay? Because this includes the country of Iran in the Middle East and Nicaragua, which is south of the United States, just north of the Panama Canal. Now, there were a group of people that were, or the Soviets were trying to influence the Nicaraguan government, and they had a group that they supported called the Sandinistas. Okay, so the Sandinistas were on the side of the Soviets. We helped a group called the Contras. We sent them weapons, we sent them money. Now, the Contras were businessmen. Okay, so these are Nicaraguans, and I know you're wondering, what about Iran? We'll get there in just a minute. So the Contras were people that the US supported. They took the money that we gave them, they invested them in cocaine, and took the cocaine that they obtained and sold it on the streets in the US. Okay? And so they actually made more money than the money we gave them. Congress finds out about this, however, and cuts off the money because they don't want drugs sold in the United States. So, Ronald Reagan sells weapons to Iran to get back US hostages. So, in Iran, they were kidnapping Americans and holding them. Okay, uh, he sold weapons to Iran to get back the hostages, but also to get back money. That money was given to the Contras. Congress then finds out about this. Okay, now realize the president of the United States cannot just sell things that belong to him. It's no different than me selling desks in the classroom or my monitors or the projector. Okay, and I can't use that money for myself or for other people. So Reagan was about to be impeached because that's called treason. On the top left-hand side, you see uh, Oliver North. He was a colonel in the Marines. He testified that he did it. He sold the weapons, and he gave the money to the Contras. And he also said that that Congress could never find any evidence because he destroyed all the evidence. And during these trials, he had his assistant Fawn Hall on the bottom left hand side shred all the evidence. So there was no evidence to get him in trouble. Okay, and by the way, he does not go to jail for this. Uh, it is believed, and this was decided by Congress, that Reagan knew about the sale of the weapons to Iran, but not the money to the Contras. He was able to really get away with all of this because he was suffering through the beginning stages of Alzheimer's. And so whenever he answered a question, not to the best of my recollection, it was actually an honest answer. And so Reagan probably got away with treason as a result of it. By the way, if you hear any stirring, it is my dog who is trying to catch his tail right now. Okay, so if you're a little bit bored, looks like George is too. So the election of 1988, it's the end of Reagan's term in office. So I'm going to go down to the bottom and then I'll work my way back from the top down here in just a moment. So George Herbert Walker Bush, bottom left hand side, he would easily get the nomination of the Republicans and easily win the election. Reagan was so popular, and everything that happened in the 1980s was also attributed to George Herbert Walker Bush. Okay. He was a former fighter pilot during World War II. He was shot down, and he was adrift for 3 days in the Pacific and barely survived. He at one point was director of the CIA, and during the 1970s, when Nixon resigned, he had to turn in his resignation to the head of the Republican Party, who was a man by the name of George Herbert Walker Bush. He was also the Vice President of the United States for 8 years, uh, and he was actually the first Vice President to win a presidential election for, well, since Martin Van Buren in 1836. So that had been 152 years. To go straight from that to office to the other without some type of assassination or death. So up on the top left-hand side, you see there's Jesse Jackson. Jesse Jackson created a rainbow coalition to try and unite the minorities to help get the Democratic nomination. He would ultimately lose to Michael Dukakis. Michael Dukakis won the Democratic nomination. He's best known for as the governor of Massachusetts, starting a program that let people out of prison for the weekend to try and encourage them to have better conduct to inspire them to get out of jail. The problem with it is uh, the number of murders and rapes greatly increased during the weekends when the prisoners were out on bail. So uh, to prove that he was strong against crime, he made a video of himself riding in a tank in a field, and that made him an even bigger political joke. On the right hand side, you can see him riding in a tank, and yeah, it didn't do anything to help him, but it did make a lot of Americans smile. So he did have that going for him. Shortly after Bush was inaugurated, uh, in China, there were several students that were protesting against communism. They were having a pro-democratic demonstration in Tiananmen Square in China. There, they made a small Statue of Liberty. The majority of almost all of the students that were protesting were gathered together and executed. You see the man standing there in front of the tank. Uh, I know what you're thinking. He's going to crush all four of those tanks. It did not work out well for him. I don't know if you remember what happened when the Germans rolled into Poland uh, with tanks against the horses, but he was barely even a speed bump to those tanks. Whenever he said, "Tanks, stop," they said, "No, tank you." It's a joke. So in December of 1989, I remember this, I was in the ninth grade. I was with my girlfriend, who would later become Amber Dawn Dugdale. At that point, she was Amber Ballard. We were watching a movie at church, and it was announced that the wall was being torn down by the people in East Berlin. So the wall had been torn down. On the left-hand side, you see two pieces of the wall that are in the Anatole Hotel in Dallas and have been there since 1990. Uh, Amber and I went there with a church group to go and see them in 1990. So the wall was broken down by the German people, and Germany would reunite in October of 1990. It's one of those pivotal moments in world history. So in 1991, the Soviet Union falls apart. Gorbachev, Mikhail Gorbachev was arrested in a coup d'etat. Remember, coup d'etats is an attempted takeover or a takeover or overthrow of the government or of some type of program. So he is arrested. The Russian president, remember, there were about 14 different nations that made up the Soviet Union. Boris Yeltsin, who is the president of Russia, rescued Gorbachev. He put him back in power. Shortly after Gorbachev was put back in power, he resigned and announced the end of the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union's over. In Panama, okay, this is about 6 or 7 years before the Panama Canal is supposed to go back to Panama. The United States sent in the Green Beret to capture the leader of Panama, a man by the name of Manuel Noriega. He was in control of Panama. The CIA actually helped put him into power whenever George Bush was part of the CIA. He also smuggled cocaine into the United States. 24 American Green Beret were died capturing Noriega. George Bush went on television and said, Noriega, never knew the fellow, but he's bad. And Saturday Night Live made a lot of jokes about that, especially whenever Bush was trying to become reelected. Didn't really work out well for him. Okay, and by the way, you can see on the map just how Panama was. Okay, now let's move into Iraq. Uh, as you know, there was a war around the time you were born, but in truth, there was a war that started 10 years earlier, or really 13 years earlier. In 1990, Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. He did that because Kuwait had a lot of money, and he did this to help pay for the war with Iran. During the 1980s, the United States supported Saddam Hussein fighting Iran because we hated Iran. So we gave him weapons and we gave him supplies to do that. But now he's attacked a country that was friends with the United States and provided oil to a lot of countries around the world that Iran and Iraq didn't. So 28 countries would support the war against Iraq. These 28 countries, or this coalition, was put together by George Herbert Walker Bush. In addition to the United States, 15 other nations would send troops to fight Iraq, including 10 Islamic nations. 16 years later, Saddam Hussein would be executed for gassing Kurdish Iraqis. That's them on the bottom left-hand side. There were about 30,000 people that lived in the city that he bombed that were killed. Men, women, children, the elderly were all killed because they had different beliefs in Islam than he did. That'd be like a bunch of Baptists killing Methodists because of differences in their religion. So that's the actual reason why Saddam Hussein was executed. He was executed because of the world courts, and well, he was dead. So For 37 days, the United States bombed Iraq nonstop. This was called Operation Desert Shield. Okay, so uh, after that period of 37 days of bombing Iraq, the United States invaded Iraq. Okay, so Iraq bombed Israel and Saudi Arabia during this time, two places where the U.S. had troops uh, to fight the Iraqis. We were able to shoot down several of their biological weapons being launched on missiles that they bought from the Soviet Union called Scud missiles. Okay, they bought them from the Soviet Union before they became. Well, anyway, they bought it before the fall of the Soviet Union. Uh, so they threatened biological weapons. They actually launched biological weapons, and once the 37 days were over, U.S. forces marched in with a new type of technology called called Global Position Satellites, or GPS. We were able to move faster through Iraq than even the Iraqis were. We got to the gates of Baghdad within 4 days. Saddam Hussein agreed to remove his troops. The U.S. liberated Cuba and ended the war. Saddam Hussein stayed in power, however. Now, this was kind of controversial, but on the other hand, if you take him out of power, then you very well force the United States to stay there and be part of the activity to clean up what's happened. So we decided not to do that, which was probably a very smart move on our part. Well, anyway, moving on. The Americans with Disabilities Act. This bans discrimination against people with mental or physical disabilities. Rodney King riot. This actually goes back to about 2 months earlier that year. Rodney King was arrested for driving under the influence and beaten for about 15 minutes by about 8 or 9 policemen. Uh, about 2 months later, went to trial. And by the way, this is one of the first events that had been caught on a camcorder of all this happening. It was broadcast on the news, and the officers were all acquitted. When that happened, there was a riot that broke out in Los Angeles, and 37 people died. That's the end of notes for today. I hope everyone has a great day. Good night and good luck.